But you know, Harris is drinking, and yes, I'm thinking, and I'm plotting and scheming. Yo. Back up in the building for another edition of the Harry's Drinking Again podcast. I am your host, Harry Too Scary, aka Mr. Harris. And in this one, we got a special one. We got a special one tonight. I'm going to sit back and become the student while we discuss with the teacher here, because we have a Titanic historian, researcher, author, and I'm sure he's not just limited to the Titanic, but this man is going to come through and tell us all about, what was it, 1912? I want to make sure that is correct. Okay, about the 1912 event heard around the world back then, and a little bit different perspective. We haven't had somebody like this on the podcast before, but thank you guys for joining us once again. And I'm going to do my best to give the best interview for this man and let him speak. So without further ado, Mr. Bill Willard.
Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to be here on this wonderful podcast. Thank you. Thank you,
sir. But yes, no, thank you, my man. You know, I was looking over your bio here, and I did listen to a few interviews that you've done on YouTube. I was checking out the Still Token with podcast, I believe, earlier today. And, you know, since you were in high school, you know, you were, very well-versed in this subject. You became fascinated with this subject at a very young age. Is that correct?
Mid 1970s. I'm getting on. This is my 48th year. This summer will start year 49 of being interested in researching this ship and all the ancillary stories. Excuse me. So, long time. Started with the book A Night to Remember. If any of your the people that listen to your show have loved the movie, I suggest they read the book A Night to Remember by Walter Lord. It's an excellent book for anybody middle school and up. If the kids have to do a book report, that's a great book report. It is a nonfiction book, which means those events in that book are real. And the author went to the different survivors to get their stories and put them in his book. And it's probably the best combination of all the stories, bunches of them being in the same place. A lot of people were interviewed by newspapers and such, but this book was the first big grouping of a lot of their stories at the same place. And Walter Lord did a fantastic job with it. They made a movie from it. That was one of the first Titanic movies. They did have a 1943 version. It was a German propaganda film during the war, trying to make the German people mad at the opulence of the British. And instead, as the ship sank, it did just the opposite effect. It made them feel sorry for what was happening. And the propaganda machine in Germany was not too happy. The director ended up being shot and killed over this. But Night to Remember is the best place to start.
Now, if I can start with this first, just to lay out my somewhat, not even knowledge, but kind of hearsay. I will say this. I'm a conspiracy guy. I always have my tinfoil hat wrapped tight. I've heard rumblings of, the people that were on the Titanic, and there's some link with like J.P. Morgan. I don't know if he was on there or he was supposed to be on there, but it to my knowledge, it has a similar feel as like a 9/11, almost 100 years later, as far as some of the pieces that were moved around on the board days before, days after, and all this. Is there any kind of truth to my way of thinking, in those regards? Could you break down some of the politics behind the Titanic and the people?
The ship was owned by managed by White Star Line, which is based in England. And it was owned by, excuse me again, the International Mercantile Marine, which the head of it was J.P. Morgan. There is a story that J.P. Morgan was possibly going to be on Titanic, but because of an ear infection or some kind of an ear problem, he didn't get on board. The conspiracy came up probably in the 1970s about the Federal Reserve and the banking and things like that. And it's words. There's no evidence to any of it. There's a man in the UK that supports it 100%, swears it happened, says there was a secret meeting in a certain hotel on a certain day. And we've asked him, how do you know? What is your evidence? And it's been about 7 years and he still can't produce it. So it's a conspiracy theory. The Vanderbilts from North Carolina sent a man in there to be on the ship. They weren't on it, and he was a very rich man in America. There were a lot of other rich families that were later involved that were not on board. So I hope that no one would have risked killing 2,000 people just for a little power like that. That's way out there. I'm sure that some people will believe it. There's a lot of good conspiracy theories about Titanic, and that is one of them that goes around.
Okay.
But not much proof to it. It's just theory. You can't prove it right, but you can't prove it wrong because there's no evidence to prove it right.
And then, excuse me. In your line of work, you deal with the facts, with the evidence, with the hard hitting, things that really went on. Was this a mechanical error? I mean, is this because it was built to never sink and everything? Go into some of that.
What you're saying is very true. Titanic was built with the most up-to-date specifications. Some of the facts are, and I'm going to hold up my little visual aid here. A teacher that I spoke in her classroom one time had this built for me, and I think it's a little 3D print of the ship, and I thought that is so nice of her. Titanic had these little watertight compartments all the way the length of the ship. Now, if you're in the Navy now, they call them bulkheads, and they run all the way through the ship, all the way sealing off different sections. If you have ever visited a Navy vessel or a submarine, you have to hunker down and step through that tight doorway. They can close that doorway, circle it up, and seal that part of the ship off. Well, Titanic was made, the design was really a brilliant design. If the ship was hit, boom, straight on like this, it would fill the compartment in which it was hit, but it wouldn't flow over those little walls. I got a tickle tonight. They went up above the bulkhead. If it hits directly on the wall, it filled up 2 compartments.
Okay.
It still would stay afloat. The engineering of this ship was that 4 of the first 5 could even fill. And I'm going to try to put it near the bottom of my screen. It would be low in the water, but it still would not flow over into the 5th compartment. So the people would be fine. They would be saved. The ship would be taken. They would put it in a dry dock, lift it up, fix those compartments. But when Titanic hits the iceberg, now I'm going to try to do this visually. It's coming toward the iceberg and it just barely glazes it and bounces off. Boom. Doesn't rip a hole down the side like was predicted. All it does is scrapes the top off of rivets so that water sprays in very fine, very, just a little solid spray. If the hole was in one place, it would be about the size of your refrigerator door. It was not that big. Your refrigerator doors, they've had worse than that. The key to it, though, was it was in the first 5 compartments, and the ship was designed to float if 4 of them were hit. So the pumps could not overtake the water. And what happened was, as the ship begins to sink below the waterline because of the 5 openings, it sank lower than it's supposed to. So the water spills over into the next one. As that fills up, it spills over into the next one, and it cascades through this way. So forensically, it was an incredible, you wouldn't expect it to take 5 compartments out. It did. They were going more southerly than they normally do. So you don't expect icebergs to have been that low in April. And it just so happened that there was at least one pack that they came upon that had this big iceberg on it. When you hold a ship's wheel, you've got spokes sticking out like this. If they would have done this one time on that trip, they would have missed it by miles.
Wow.
Okay. This was one of those, it happened. Nobody did anything that was improper. Nobody did anything. Could they have done things differently? Of course, but nobody knew to do anything differently. By the time they realized there was an iceberg in front of them, they tried to avoid it.
Was it dark and like foggy? Was it weather conditions? Is it? And then
it was clear as a bell, and that's what the problem was. Because it was clear as a bell, you take this iceberg, and the water splashes up on it. And what you can see is the white water, the white caps of the splashing. And that's what makes it so easy to see. But when the sea was calm, it wasn't splashing. It would be like on a lake, for example, on a non-windy night. And you have to be very careful. And, you know, something that's almost 3 football fields long, there it is. We're talking almost 900 feet long, won't turn on a dime. And they immediately ordered to turn left to try to go around the iceberg. They wanted to go around it. But this ship was slow to respond because it's so huge. You know, you can't just turn on a dime in that thing. And it was starting to turn as it got close, and it just lightly scraped. It was
so like
fluke is a good word for it, I guess. It was just an incredible amount of bad luck.
With the design of the ship, like the engineers, they made it to where it's supposed to, you know, withstand, you know, this flood of waters, these different compartments, and then but some little old, you know, rivets across the top, just kind of, you know, was there?
Scrape the top off is all it did. Just scrape the top off.
Was this like a something, you know, like, you know, when they're building things and they're putting cars through crash tests and they're going over every possible scenario? Like, for the time, was it just kind of back then nobody, you know, was thinking crazily outside the box? Like, hey, what if, you know, one of these rivets get loose? Can it water fill up another way? You know?
Well, if it would be in one compartment. They could seal that up, but 5 was difficult. Right behind me, you'll see a picture of the side of Titanic that we recovered in 1998. All those little dots are rivets. So the ship had tens of thousands of those rivets all over the ship. And the iceberg just scraped a few of them. And that's what happened. It was totally a fluke. There was always a claim that the steel had problems with it, that it wasn't good, that it had weaknesses and flaws in the steel, a poor quality steel, in other words. And but the response to that is this had the best steel at the time. All the other ships had the same steel and the same quality of it. Olympic came out before and sailed until 1939. It wasn't the rivets. It wasn't the quality of the steel. So that sort of died out. I guess it'll come back one of these days. But they took some of these pieces and they did cuts, and they took and looked at it under a microscope, and you could see some impurities in the steel. But every ship made had those same impurities at that time. So is it as good as the steel they use today? No, because there's better refining processes today. But that was the best they had in those days.
Has the whole Titanic been found, or is there still pieces down there at all? Maybe the whole thing's
when it started to sink, just as shown in the movie, the front end got very heavy and went underwater, and the back end did come out. There is an entire volume of people that will argue, what angle did this ship go up? Did it go up 30 degrees? Did it go up 70 degrees? What was the angle of this ship? And it's amazing how they will argue their point. And that part doesn't intrigue me as much. We know that it did come up, but it broke. It broke between the third and the fourth funnels. In this area were dining facilities and kitchens and things like that. The bow went down and hits the bottom. The stern spiraled as it went down and landed about a quarter of a mile away. And between the two is this intense debris field of broken iron, where pieces have broken and splintered. They've also recovered the majority of their artifacts from the debris field area because they sprinkled out as the ships went down. And they found everything, a lot of plates, a lot of cooking ware and things of that nature. But there was a lot of personal things like luggage, carry bags, things of that nature. So that was where the majority of it came from. But it's a quarter of a mile apart. I've got a picture from when we were out there in 1998 where you can see one ship on the bow, and then in the distance you can see another ship, and they're diving on the stern at the same time. And you get to see a representation on the top of the ocean, how far they are apart on the bottom.
Wow. Now, I'm going to sound foolish, but of course I watched the movie, but I haven't seen it in so long, and I was a young kid. But to what I remember, and just in a general sense, like if your last few hours on this earth are, because there was only a certain number of lifeboats, and only a certain number of a lot of people were saved, a lot weren't. Is that correct? Like
there were 2,208 on board, and 712 were saved, about a third.
Okay.
1496 did not survive that night.
Was there a scene in the movie, I could be mistaken, but where there was like a woman and a child that were trying to get on the lifeboat, but there was a man that, like, I don't know, pushed him out of the way, or he jumped on the lifeboat instead to save himself? I could be mistaken, but was there any reference of that, or do you know of any knowledge of like those people's last few hours? Was there, raping and pillaging? Was it a lot of praying? And, is there any...
Things came out at one time. CBS knew that Cameron was working on his movie, so they made a mini-series on television, and it came out a few months before Cameron's movie did. I remember that George C. Scott played Captain Smith, and Catherine Zeta-Jones, I think, was in it, and Peter Gallagher. But the other person that was in it, I like Tim Curry. I like everything he acts in, but I didn't like his role in the CBS miniseries of Titanic. He was a bad guy. And so I think it may show something like that in the miniseries. James Cameron had an incredible movie. Now, I do call it Jack and Rose on the Love Boat sometimes, because the Jack and the Rose and the Cal Hockley and the big diamond, or the big, Le Coeur de la Mer, the big stone, was Hollywood. That was his fictitious story surrounded by an incredible truth about Titanic. He went to great detail to make the background as accurate as he could. I was so impressed looking in those rooms, and I really thought that's what Titanic would look like had I been alive in 1912. I was just so impressed with the detail and things like that. One thing he did that you would appreciate. Now, the real Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:37 p.m. It sank and went beneath the waves. The stern went down, at 2:20 a.m. So that was 2 hours and 43 minutes. Like you said a minute ago, people began to realize that they are going to die. They're not going to survive this accident. In Cameron's movie, if you have a stopwatch and you start it when the theater ship, when his movie ship hits the iceberg, and then you stop it when the back end finally goes under, it's 2 hours and 43 minutes. He made that time realistic. And just the time you're sitting there with popcorn and your drink, that was the amount of time those people had to deal with this situation. Many people have tried to write, what would you do if you were facing this situation and you were a male and you were not, some of the first class males did make it in, very few second class did, and the only third class did were very lucky. So you and I would be, wow, what are we going to do? We have very few options. And if you and I had been married at that time, our first responsibility and our first thing that we had to do was to get our spouse on board. That would have been our first function. We do everything we could to save our wives, and then we figure out what are we going to do for us at that time. So many incredible decisions and so many crucial points happened in 2 hours and 43 minutes.
Yeah. That's not, when you say it like that, like the first, second, third class, you're back then it was like a racial as well as financial class, economic class. There were probably like the maybe immigrant workers, stewards and stuff like that would still be, some of the workers didn't get saved. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, the third class was the poorest of the poor who were coming over to America mostly to start their lives new. In Ireland, for example, there were a lot of Irish immigrants that were coming to America. One of my research areas is with this group from County Mayo, which is Western Ireland. I've been over there, stayed for a few days, met some of the family members of these people. But they had 14 of their village. Now, this village only had 92 people in it. So 14 of those set sail on Titanic to come to America, and 11 did not survive. It only cost £7 in those days to get on the ship. But that area of Ireland was, we're talking dirt poor. Dirt poor meaning whatever came out of the dirt is what caused them to live. If they had animals and if they had some farming, they were going to survive, but they didn't have enough to sell to anyone because the other people didn't have money to buy it. They were doing the same things. And so £7 is about $10 in today's money. It took them 2 to 3 years to save up that much money for those kids, those people to get on that ship. And that's the steerage. That's third class. A lot of steerage passengers were on board. The upper class, the first class, we're talking the mega rich. The people that would have been on first class today would have been the Michael Jordans, LeBron James. Aaron Rodgers is promised 53 or 54 million if he plays next year. He would be first class. Sam Walton, the Walton family that owns Walmarts, would have been in first class. Second class would have been doctors and lawyers and people that own smaller department stores, CEOs, people like that. And so there was a big distinction between that first class mega rich, second class, and then the very, very poor socioeconomic. I would have been third class. I could not have afforded anything like that. Second class would have been only if I had been working for a while and had saved up and, taking my first cruise and wanting to enjoy it.
Do they have a breakdown of like the actual races? Like were there blacks, whites, Latinos? Do you have an actual breakdown of that?
There were 23 different countries on board.
Okay.
And those, if you break down each of those, the only pure African American family was from Haiti. It was Joseph LaRoche. Now he had married a French who was Caucasian, and so his his children were half and half. You know what I'm talking about? Half
Yeah.
Caucasian, half African American.
Breeds, yeah.
And I don't know what the correct term for that is. My apologies.
I
I
call
just
myself a mixed breed. I'm a mixed breed. Some people biracial, whatever. Yeah.
they're biracial. That's I think the correct term.
Proper.
When I look at somebody, I deal with you because of how you talk and how you treat people. That's what I think is important in life. So I don't worry about a lot of those type things. But Louise LaRoche was the sweetest lady. She was such a pretty lady as she grew up, and she was one of the the last ones to pass away. But I think he was the only true African American on board. There were Spanish, there were Serbian, there were Turks, English, Scottish, Ireland, Norwegian, Sweden, and Finland. It's a long night. So all these countries, there was even someone from South America that had been on it. There was, of course, American Canada. That's where they were coming to. But 23 different countries. There were China and Japan were even represented. And that's what caused some of the problems is you've got this multi group, this huge group, a microcosm with so many different components. And people see a sign on the wall and they have no idea what it's written in because they don't speak English. So the first thing is they have to find out where their cabin is. So they try to find a sign that matches what it says on their ticket. And people have to show them how to get there. But when the tragedy started, they didn't know what to do. And when people would say, okay, here's what you need to do, get your life belt on, get up, get ready to go up. We're going to go into the main meeting room. They're going, what? In their own language. So there was a horrible confusion in those situations. It really was sad. After Titanic's accident, there was an American inquiry. William Alden Smith out of Michigan, excuse me, held an American inquiry. And Senator Smith, he was from Michigan, senator from Michigan, would ask these different questions, and they came up with a bunch of conclusions on what caused the problem. And one of which led to laws being passed. Any boat that lands or ship that lands on American soil, in other words, you dock at an American port, had to have enough lifeboats for every passenger and crewman on board. If you go on a cruise right now and that ship holds 2,500 people, they're going to have lifeboats for 4,000. They just have more than they need to. Another thing is led to, again, if you've gone on a cruise, the first thing you do before you set sail is you go to a muster drill. It tells you your muster station is station D. And so you'll report to station D. They will check your name off and they'll say, when you come out here, if there is an emergency and you hear, please report to your muster stations, you will tell your name. Now they've got little tablets. They can click off your name very quickly to check you in. Used to, they'd put them on clipboards and things like that and have a clipboard there and they'd check off everybody as they got into a lifeboat. They lower a lifeboat. You ever go into a hallway and put a school book over your head when you're in elementary school? Tornado drills?
Yeah.
Okay.
So,
fire drills,
fire
things
drill.
like that, all came from this same idea that we need to know what to do in the event of an emergency in situations where there's lots of people. And so some good did come from the tragedy in that sense. Mm-hmm. But as they began to load the lifeboats, the first and second class people were coming up on deck. The first class thought, I don't want to get in that little boat. That's not what I'm here for. I want to go back down and have a cup of tea. And so finally they let the women know, we need you to get in, ma'am. Please come this way. Women, we need women. They were afraid. They wanted to get the boats away early because they knew if they were later, there would be panic and lots of ugly things could happen. A lot of people swarming the lifeboats and things of that nature. So it was unimaginable is the term you're talking about. Did they plan on some of this kind of stuff happening? They never thought a lot of these things could happen.
Yeah, it's just to think of your last few moments and the the terror that must have been, going on. Uh, Even the movie, great movie, doesn't even do justice. It's like, to give you a quick history for myself, I've never been on a cruise, but I did. I used to be a fisherman in Alaska, and I was on the processor boats. I've been on a smallest one, I think it was like 18, 24 footer. It was about 12 men. And then I was on like maybe 80 footer, the Sea Freeze Alaska out of Dutch Harbor. And now myself, I'm scared of water. I go into my knees in maybe a lake. I don't do oceans and I don't do diving boards, love showers, a jacuzzi, whatever. But we did the mustard drills and everything, put our survival suit on. They just told us, this is the Bering Sea. You, I think with your survival suit, you could last like 12 hours, but even in the middle of June, you got maybe 30 seconds in that frigid water before you seize up and you're gone. So I always looked at it like, I'm out here to make the dollar. And if anything did go bad, then, there's nothing I could do. So I made peace on the flight, there every time. But can you talk about some of the engineering on like just a basic modern, ship? There was a Captain Phil Harris, who was on the Deadliest Catch. There was a boat that sank a decade or so ago. RIP to that crew. So, but what is the safety factor? Maybe against versus some of your fishing vessels, and then your cruise ships. Are they all built to the same, I guess certifications? But is one deadlier than the other in a sense?
Ooh, big question there. Looking at 1912, now something was happening in 1912 that they didn't have 20 years before that. They had Marconi. Deet, 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 and they could send a signal electronically. Other ships could hear them and could come to their aid. If you look at the coast off of the Carolinas, there's 1,000 ships that have been lost over time that they have documented. They call it the graveyard of the Atlantic. The Grand Banks, which runs from about New York and Boston, that area, all the way parallel to the coast of Canada. It's not very deep. It's about 300, maybe 400 yards in some places. But then once it gets to the edge of the Grand Banks, it drops straight down, and Titanic was into the deep down areas. But they find ships occasionally that are on that ledge, and there's hundreds missing. There are all sorts of books. Nigel Pickford did an atlas of shipwrecks, and it's got over 1,000 shipwrecks in it. And you look at that Grand Banks area, and there's dots where these ships approximately disappeared off the coast of North Carolina. Small ships, larger, even. We only hear about the major ships like the Andrea Doria, the Lusitania, which was struck by a torpedo, Titanic struck by an iceberg. But they had numerous ships with people on board before then. They don't know what happened to them. They just left port and they never were seen again.
Is this,
Those
are you
ships still are
talking
down.
pre and post Titanic? Like even in this modern era, we still lose ships, recently.
We lose some these days, much less than before because of the technology. Ships now have radar, so they can see something coming towards them in plenty of time to avoid it. There are still, to say that nobody sinks these days is an impossible statement to make. There will still be ships sinking. But the good news is they can save the people in them now. And usually it's some kind of an unusual disaster and the ship goes down with very few people at loss. The most recent one that I know of is the Costa Concordia, I think. And that was the one where the captain was going a little bit too far over and a rock ripped the side of his ship and the ship turned over and sank, and it was halfway underwater. They were in very shallow water. So the ship didn't completely go underwater. And I think there was still several people that died in it, even though most got off safely. And that was due to an error by the captain. So it does happen. It's very rare. Anything that floats can sink if the right method of events happen to it. But the frequency of it now is tremendously less than it was in those years.
Yeah. I remember on my journey, my first time sitting in the galley and I was taking a nap and like I woke up to like, ship shaking and I look out the galley window and it's pure black. And 2 seconds goes by and we're up on the swell and it's pure blue for miles. And then we're down again. And I was like, oh, I freaked out. And I went out a little bit not even on the deck, but opened up the little door just to look up at the swell. And I'm like, the deckhands are out there. And I see a guy, he's standing there. I mean, it's like, 20, 30 foot water on the side of the boat. And then we go back up. And I was just right there at that moment. I was just even mind blown and like the architecture, the engineering, how is all this possible? It just blew me away. Do you have an opinion on that flight 370, that Malaysian airplane that went missing like 10 years ago? Like, how does something like that happen? And to my knowledge, it still hasn't been found. Like, how do we lose a plane, but
it went down below radar and they don't know what happened to it after that?
Yeah.
They had a general area that they thought it may be, but you're talking, tens of thousands of square miles. It will take years to cover and sweep some of those areas. It took them it was 70 years to find Titanic. So I think they'll eventually find remains of that flight. I know that the families need some closure. But when it went down under radar, there was no idea it could have even turned as it was going under radar and not even be in that grid that they think it may have landed in. Yeah. And of course, they use just good common sense. If the flight pattern is going in this path here, they estimate it to be here, because that's the predicted path. If it varies just a little bit, it still will be within a certain window there. And so every time I hear of something like that, it just, I just close my eyes and hope that they were able to find some survivors. But after a while, they didn't. You're talking about getting in your suits, your neoprene suits. When we went out there in 1998, we were on board the Ocean Voyager. It was a little bit bigger than your ship, but we all had to pass we called them Gumby suits, even though they were bright orange. We had to get in them within 2 minutes. We had to go from standing up with our Gumby suit to being fully in, zipped up, hat on, 2 minutes. If we couldn't pass the 2-minute test, we weren't supposed to be on board.
Yeah, that's what they did with us too.
And so you've got to be able to get into them quickly. And like you said, it keeps your body temperature tight. You have a whistle, you have a light so they can locate you quickly. But even if the water's as cold as you had it up in the Bering Strait, oh my goodness, that's the Bering Sea is horrifically cold. And it'll only work for so long. When we were at the end of the 98 expedition, Hurricane Bonnie struck North Carolina and turned eastward to go out into the ocean. And we were very happy. It was about 400 miles south of us. And all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, it turned and was heading straight at us. So we got up early the next morning and they were battening the hatches. They were tying ropes around things. They were securing things in the galley, all areas. They were locking in cupboards. They were doing everything like that, closing them up. And we were told, do not go outside. If you fall over, we'll never find you because we're going to be in a hurricane. And a lot of the people on that ship were landlubbers. They didn't like 8 and 12-foot swells. And then as we hit the storm, we started going up and coming down, and we rode 80-foot swells for 17 hours.
Yeah.
And it was awful. And there was a funny story out of that, though, is right across from my cabin was the big restroom, and it had 4 seats and 4 shower heads. Now, if the women needed to go, one would stay outside while a lady went in, and then they'd change places. That's the way we did it. Guys did the guy thing, we just went in. But the women needed their privacy, so somebody stayed at the door. So guys, if they went in anytime during this hurricane, they would come out and their pants were wet. And the reason why is if you're a guy, you can't hold the walls with 2 hands and do what you need to do. You get my meaning. The fire hose is going crazy. And so all these guys were coming out with wet pants. And finally, I said, guys, if you sit down, you don't have that problem. And they're going, oh, wow, we never thought of that.
Yeah.
So they had to learn how to exist with a huge, huge swell system that we were in.
Yeah.
But I was very relieved when we started getting out of those swells.
Man, I didn't get seasickness until about, we call them trips, like my 3rd or 4th trip out. But this storm was just insane. And, I remember trying to like take a shower in that little, thing, and I'm bouncing around. And then we had the cold steel. This thing like, hitting the cold steel, and it was just miserable. God, it just, it was a great time. Great camaraderie out there. But I thought I was, so 80, yeah, I was gonna say like 50-foot swell. I said like 20 or 30, but it might have been like, just insane. Like buildings on the side of you, and then boom, back up, and oh my God, it was just it was terrifying. Harry's drinking again.